Hello, I'm Barbara Lee Diamonstein. Welcome to American Architecture Now. Today we'll be talking to William Conklin. Architect, archaeologist, and preservationist William Conklin is known for his far-ranging ideas and his superb designs. He is also known for his dedication to small-scale amenities as well as large-scale urban planning. It's a real pleasure to have you with us today, Bill.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
Bill, you really do have an extraordinary story. How does a guy who grew up in a town with a population of 80, 15 miles from the county seat, Hubbell, Nebraska, end up as an international architect, archaeologist, and textile connoisseur? How did that all happen?
Well, it's all because the fact that little town was a well-structured community. It was really a kind of model town, you might say, and somehow or other architecture and community life and the form of the city were very coherent. It was a wonderful world for me as a child, and it remains a kind of model, in a sense, of sort of how community and urban design can work together.
Was there any architectural tradition in your own family?
Well, as a matter of fact, a slight one. My father actually designed the facade of his bank building, which has sort of flattened out Greek columns on it, sort of slightly postmodern-ish, if you will. And he actually designed that little bank front.
The fact is that you left Hubbell at a very young age to go away to school. How did you manage to end up in New Hampshire?
Well, in New Hampshire I attended a school which was in a sense at the opposite end of this extremes of sophistication, if you will, Phillips Exeter Academy, where I went to prep school. I attended prep school there for a few years, coming really immediately out of the almost rural background of Nebraska, because of the fact my father had also attended that school as a child.
But how did he get there?
His father, who was also a banker, wanted to know how he should educate his son, who was growing up in this small town in Nebraska. And his father, looking for an appropriate source of substantial advice, traveled by some means I don't know how he did up to Omaha, where he spoke to the president of the Omaha National Bank and said, where should I send my son to school? And the bank president answered Phillips Exeter Academy, and thus the tradition began. My grandfather apparently walked out, asked no questions, asked for no other suggestions or recommendations, simply took this from the proper source.
When and how did you decide to become an architect?
I found myself interested in really a variety of fields. I was interested in art. I did a certain amount of painting, and I took courses in art, and I was also interested in mathematics. I was interested in physics. I was interested in engineering. And in speaking to a sort of counselor, advisor in the school about sort of what I might do, he suggested that one field that could combine all these interests would be architecture. One draws then the light bulb at that point in the comic strip, and then proceeded to decide where I wanted to go to school, and searched around for schools at that time in the United States, and finally ended up at the Graduate School of Design, studying under Walter Gropius at Harvard.
What was the influence of Gropius?
Well, Gropius, I think, was most productive and profound in his description, if you will, of the role of the architect, and pointing out to the students the kind of range of opportunities and the range of responsibilities that they had in the world. Obviously, he himself used as a model the work in the Bauhaus, which he had, of course, done in Germany in the previous decades to that.
Did you know Gropius? Did you have any dealings with him?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes,
well,
very much so.
What was he like?
Oh, he was a very warm and generous and tolerant person, and a great leader of sort of debates and discussion when design criticism occurred. He would always lead the discussion in a way which was, on the one hand, generous to the student, invitational to the other professors to comment, never putting down, never derogatory.
What did Gropius look like, and how did he live?
Well, his house is, of course, a white walled structure of the late 30s, a modernist building with glass brick and some glass brick curved walls here and there, and some sort of space frames out in the garden. and a sort of well-manicured place, not in any way elaborate, really, not luxurious. Its interior details were not so very interesting, and perhaps in that sense, when it really came down to sort of fine design points, Gropius didn't have unique and special answers.
What were the problems that students were trying to solve then?
Well, the school at that time was structured in such a way that one began really with a set of problems that were community-minded in their orientation. The very first problem was a community center. The student attempted to solve all the range of social problems that, of the community, as well as the physical and architectural problems of the context of the building. And then one proceeded through the school in a way tackling larger and larger problems until one had, large-scale city planning problems in the final year.
What kind of school did Gropius set up?
One of the things that he did, of course, that has been most controversial is the fact that he kicked out of the school all study of the history of architecture. Growing up in Europe and trying to practice architecture there, the presence of all the architecture of Europe was, in his opinion, simply overwhelming, too dominating, and that he felt that one had to clear one's mind of all that and sort of start fresh. And therefore, when he came to this country and started the school, he established as one of the rules that no student would be allowed to study the history of architecture.
Was that a good idea? Do you think your education suffered as a result of denying the past?
Of course, people did sort of sneak around that rule a little bit. He did permit courses in what he called the history of urban design. And therefore, we could go and hear about how Greek towns were planned and how Roman cities were organized, and something of the history of Italian town planning.
You've said that you did a lot of things at that school that America did later. What did you mean by that? And what were you doing?
One of the problems would be clearing away old areas of buildings and of old cities and establishing the new order of the new architecture. And therefore we did lots of studies in which we would wipe out half of Boston and study ideally what it might look like, if we were the architect for the whole thing, once again, new and fresh. Then laws in this country were changed, and the Urban Renewal Act was passed by Congress, and the idea of sort of clearing away old buildings and to permit new to occur became the law of the land. So I remember that we studied the shopping centers really before they existed in suburban areas in America, and Gropius and associated planners could see the need for such solution.
As a student, you were trained to design new towns. What were your first assignments after graduation?
The opportunity arose through a client of the firm, Mr. Robert E. Simon, to plan and design a new town which was to be constructed outside of Washington, D.C. So I and my partner, Jim Rassant, jumped into this with great enthusiasm and spent really many years working on that, and did the general master plan for the new town of Reston, but concentrated most specifically on the architectural design of the first portion of that new town to be constructed, called the Lake Ann Center. The architecture tends to sort of enclose the spaces of the main plaza of the town and the water of the lake that we created, enclose them in such a way that hopefully it gives some sense of sort of security and sense of place to those residents who live there.
I guess with the population explosion of 20-some-odd years ago, we really needed, at least we thought we needed, new towns. Is Reston a success?
Reston, I think, is very much a success. It stands head and shoulders, I think, above most American new towns that were started at approximately the same or slightly later time. I think it's a success because it's beloved by its inhabitants, and is a fine place to live, a place that people who live there are proud of. But perhaps it didn't grow successfully And really, that's the problem that we all face in cities. There are always times when there are wonderful buildings and wonderful places, but then they all get changed and they get destroyed.
Well, if new towns aren't the answer to America's urban problems, to what should we be directing our energies?
Well, I think increasingly we know that we have to put higher and higher value on the existing structures of our communities, and we realize increasingly that the buildings and structures of our urban environments are of great value. They're like friends. If we value our own sort of structure of friendships and social contexts in the world, so the structure of buildings and their interrelations are of value also.
How so?
Well, what used to be called simply sort of irrelevant detail, to use Gropius's terms, increasingly we realize is the really the elaboration of language of architecture, and that the forms that are used have meaning and history, convey ideas, have precedence.
How'd you end up in New York?
I came logically to the conclusion, looking at all the statistical projections of the United States and so on, that there were two places to establish practice, and one of these was Seattle, and the other was, of course, Houston. However, the job that came along was in New York, and so I quickly tossed out the academic paper and took the job. It was a job actually by an organization that was sponsored by Nelson Rockefeller for the construction of low-cost housing. And, you know, it was in a fancy office at the top of the RCA building, and it was a wonderful opportunity.
Well, you've also had the opportunity to build other buildings right here in New York City, and those that are respectful of architectural traditions. And one is 333 East 69th Street on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and another one is Butterfield House in Greenwich Village.
In the case of 333 69th Street, we of course introduced into the ground floor of the building, in the ground 2 stories, a group of small townhouses which have direct access to the street and therefore have some of the social characteristics as well as the visual characteristics of the townhouses on the street, even though it's a pretty big building for a side street in New York. Butterfield House actually has, of course, its rather rich pattern of bay windows on its 12th Street facade. This really was suggested by another building that was down on 12th Street between 6th and 7th Avenues. And so taking that as a kind of thesis, my partner Jim Rossant and I together worked out the solution to Butterfield House, which does involve a kind of glassy version of bay windows and limestone spandrels and an interior garden, which was richly a landscaped interior garden.
Could those two buildings be built today, and if they could, would you do them the same way?
I'm very proud of them, but I also know perfectly well that of course one wouldn't do the same thing again. I think they continue both to live very well on their streets.
You said that the first function of every urban building is to play a constructive role in the city. What do you mean when you say constructive?
It should not be a building which makes its adjacent buildings look ridiculous. It shouldn't be a building that casts other buildings in the shade of its own shadow. It should be a building which is, you know, relates somehow or other to its existing context and is respectful of that.
Recently you had an assignment to design a memorial arch for the United States Navy. What were your concerns when designing this really heroic monument?
I was not hired to do a memorial arch. I was hired to do, you know, a memorial and a place for the performance of the United States Navy Band, and I'm still under contract actually to do that and working on a variety of new answers. It's at a place where the 8th Street of Washington, D.C. crosses Pennsylvania Avenue at an intersection halfway between the Capitol and the White House. it is a place really for a great and monumental sort of urban statement.
How does your design fit in with the historic design and scale of Pennsylvania Avenue?
In general, it is the same size and the same kind of detail as, for instance, the Archive building, which is directly across the street. Pennsylvania Avenue is an enormous avenue. So somehow or other, the size of it, and I think the scale of it, one felt was appropriate actually to its site. It was received in some quarters very well by the Fine Arts Commission.
They approved of the design.
Yes, it was approved, but it eventually stumbled and met finally vigorous opposition from the National Capital Planning Board, which really represents the local community interests, who felt...
What do they object?
I think that arch proposal is a kind of, it's a very simple and powerful and strong thing, and maybe it's too simplistic for our rather pluralistic age. I mean, you know, to build something in the city today, you have to satisfy many kinds of interests. And we're now working actually on an entirely different kind of answer, which...
What do the alternate plans, what form do they take?
Well, in general, we're going to create a sort of circular plaza, which will have sculpture within it, and it will not be a large-scale, heroic structure. The buildings themselves surrounding it will supply the kind of large-scale needs which that important intersection calls for, I think.
You've said that museums are modern-day cathedrals. Is that meant as praise?
Well, it's meant as really observation of fact. Certainly in our society, I mean, the museum is the place that one really goes, in a sense, to sort of, you know, worship the holy other, that which one doesn't understand. One finds most effectively in confrontation with art today, and I think this is really true, more so than perhaps in our churches and religious institutions. I think they have become that very much.
Have you ever designed any religious institutions?
The Ramar School, which is on 78th Street here in Manhattan, between Madison and Park, is a school constructed on a side street and housing a full range of facilities for an Orthodox Jewish education, including underground gym and a whole lot of classrooms and other facilities, and given a very special facade on 78th Street.
It does have a sleek aluminum facade that is punctuated by, I guess, unusual, odd-shaped windows.
The meaning of the facade has to be understood in really sort of terms of two or maybe three considerations. One is the context itself. What is the street like and what kinds of buildings are around it? And there, if we look at that street, we discover that there are, of course, many houses and townhouses which have small vertical windows in groupings of 4s and 5s, and that kind of punctuation is part of the vocabulary of the street. And then secondly, one has to look at the internal function of the building itself and its meaning and its different rooms, different spaces, and discover that some of the variety on the outside of the building is directly related to those internal functions.
Your work as a commissioner, in fact, the vice chairman of the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission, keeps you very much involved in those issues too. How has it had an effect on the architectural profession?
The study and then the sort of closer look at all of the existing architectural heritage, I think, has enlarged every architect's range of design ideas and his vocabulary of forms a great deal. Architects all across the country are interested and working hard at restoring old buildings and making them into new uses and solving their technical problems so that they can be saved.
What does that mean, Bill?
Consider an example here in New York. A Greek Revival church with beautiful white columns out in front and a little classic steeple up on top gets designated as a landmark and saved, quote, therefore. But in order to save it, one has to, the developer has to gut the inside put in condos and little efficiency apartments.
And that has been done.
And this has been done. And so the building is, quote, saved, but what does it mean now, And I somehow rather think that as we move on in the landmarks movement, we'll find some way to make a closer fit between internal function and external form and meaning.
You're not only interested in American architecture, you're interested and knowledgeable about South American architecture and artifacts, especially textiles. How did that interest all develop?
Oh gosh, I suppose that the interest in South American archaeology probably stems from something as simple as seeing a poster of Machu Picchu or something like that, and then going on a trip down there like everybody else in the world does. And I think that textiles in ancient Peruvian cultures were very important, not like ours today. Everybody knew how to weave, and everything that they made was a textile structure. They made boats as textiles, and they made bridges as textiles. And in addition to clothing and all the ordinary kinds of things, textile structure was the high technology of ancient Peru.
Are you interested in the textiles of other cultures?
Not in any way to the extent that I am in those from ancient Peru, and I really can't explain why, except that there's only a certain amount of room in one's mind, that's all.
Well, there was room in your mind and your heart and your work to explore other cultures, sufficiently so to develop a new capital for Tanzania.
Well, my partner Jim Rassant was first of all called as a consultant actually to the government of the United Nations and to the government of Tanzania, and from that has evolved the firm's work in the planning of this new capital for that country.
Why was there a need for a new capital in Tanzania?
The goals of this new socialist country were to create a new image for itself and also to build something which would be closer to the center of the country itself. So our plans for that new capital structure are ones that we hope are very coherent with the kind of goals of the country. It's a low capital structure. It will be a maximum of 4 stories high. And so for this, rather hard up country, to be able to build a new capital at all, one has to do so with a degree of, conservation about energy and money.
Did you ever expect your life to unfold the way it has?
Gee, I think that life has new surprises at every turn, and I don't think it's possible to anticipate all that. No, I don't think so, no.
What's been the greatest satisfaction of your career?
Professionally, gee, I suppose that one would pick out Reston, really, I suppose, because there we really built, a whole group of buildings together, and we did all the different kinds of buildings and different functions, and there's a chance to let architectural conversation occur between one building and another one across the street, and to do the whole thing. And that's the greatest pleasure of all. One dreams of that opportunity to not do one object, but to do a group of them that can then sort of talk to each other. And that's when the real chorus can occur if one is lucky.
Your life is so rich and full and varied in textures. What next, Bill Conklin?
Gee, I don't know. The next commission is always the most exciting one, and that's what every architect thinks. Actually, though, to be very serious, we really are intensely involved right now in Market Square in Washington, and we know the site well, having gone through a couple of solutions that haven't yet seen the light of day, and we're working very intensively on that situation, and that's a great privilege because it's center of the nation, and therefore one touches history and tradition, and one touches contemporary life, and in the middle of an important city, and that's the kind of opportunity that is a great privilege to work on.
For sharing your thoughtful ideas with us and doing it with such grace and eloquence, our special thanks to you.
Thank you.